Today I'm here to talk about reanimating Romanticism and the spirit of John Keats on site in Roman places and virtual spaces. My part in the Layers of Rome teaching course is to design a class that connects literary walking tours and links this with the powerful visual of ancient Roman sites, the Palatine, the Colosseum, the Baths of Caracalla. And these are sites that inspired the great poems of Romantic writers, and where Rome's classical past is re-envisioned and memorialized in the Romantic Empire, the way that we see, for example, permanency. The Romantics, in a sense, are much like us, and all human themes of literature can be found in these wonderful Roman sites. In week 2 of the course, we go to the Keats Shelley Memorial House and the Protestant Cemetery. These are two sites that represent a newer layer of Rome, 19th century Rome, and are dedicated to the legacy of John Keats and Romanticism. In this course, I have essentially 3 goals: to awaken the interest in Romanticism and John Keats by harnessing the power of the sites we visit, to teach students to read a poem thoughtfully, and then to mediate and to think about this poem in ways which have impact on their lives in positive ways, so that they question platitudes and make their own decisions and find an authentic identity. And last, I hope that they'll be interested then in preserving these cultural identities and sites. This year in 2020, thanks to COVID CID, we put our site design course online and designed a virtual course that used site-based learning. We started with historical scaffolding and built in other layers. We had Deborah from the University of Texas, El Paso create a lecture for us on the Colosseum with a virtual screen showing him at the Colosseum, and we Zoomed essentially through sites. Where we're going next with this project is preserving identities. And for me, this means creating a literary walking tour in another sense. More on that a little bit later. One idea, though, one intersection with the University of Texas, El Paso, will be the creation of digital materials that might enhance a student's visit to Rome. In the picture that you're seeing right here, we're on the Palatine, and we can walk in the footsteps of Thomas Hardy, who indeed wrote a poem called On the Palatine, and have an enhanced experience. Or an audible clip and materials could be put on the UTEP site and can be accessible from just about anywhere. But preservation begins with also bringing to life poets who have long been dead, and we have to compete quite a bit in the digital age with distractions and disruptions. So what can we do to make Keats human and relatable, and to encourage students to spend the time parsing through allusions which are not familiar to them, and doing some of the hard work that goes with reading poetry. And for me, the new tropes and content that come from exciting biographical and visual content available in new biographies by Hay, Rowe, Motion, Wu, and Wilson can be mined for topics that will interest our students. In the words of Duncan Wu, we like poets who are hot, young, and doomed. And John Keats was all 3. In class sessions on site, I emphasize the relationship of Fanny Braun and John Keats and the joy and suffering that she brought to his existence, to his writing of poetry. Other kinds of topics that students find very, very memorable and connect with are Keats's illness, his suffering and loss, having lost both parents by the time he was 15 years old, and his own sense that he was doomed to tuberculosis, an illness that had killed a brother and his mother. And so in a desperate attempt to save his life, he goes to Rome, departs from Fanny in a very sorrowful way. And this prepares students for what they'll see in Rome. That is the Keats Shelley Memorial House and the Protestant Cemetery. This is my attempt to try to disrupt my students from Netflix or a Nicholas Sparks novel. When we're in Rome on sites, The other thing that I try to do is harness the power of visual eulogies. So when we walk into the Baths of Caracalla, we're in what Giuseppe Albano has described as visual eulogies. And that is places where we can say Romanticism is represented in the space itself. The sublime and the melancholic feelings that we see in a poem by John Keats are hard to just read as words. But in the site, and students will see flowers and fauna coming out of the crevices of the glories of Roman Empire, of these baths. They start to see this idea of death and the commingling of death with ephemeral beauty. So there's a sense that nature is taken over death, but itself is, has an ephemerality to it as well. They tend to get Romanticism and be very engaged with the site. And I'll leave this idea with what a student said, that in the site, he understood Keats more in the space than he did in a semester. In week 2, we move from these memento mori, these Roman sites, to the Keats Shelley House, a place that is dedicated to the Romantic poets and is the space where John Keats spent his remaining months in Rome. Students entering into the site go into the same room where Keats spent his last months of his life. They're able to see memorabilia in the site, including locks of his hair, and the site remains a working library. It has exhibits, and it reaches out to preservation in some new and interesting ways by going out to immigrant children and reading poetry for them. Right now, the site is getting rest and refurbishment because of COVID COD, and they're able to do some kind of painting in the ceilings. So it's something for us to look forward to. In the end, where we all end up is in cemeteries, and this is the last site visit. It's a place for us to build upon some of the ideas of melancholy, to be thoughtful. And as we walk around the graves of Keats and Shelley, we can do things that really gravitate the students to the site and are very powerful and moving. We were able to read lines from Shelley's Adonais that was dedicated to John Keats, and where Shelley's own son is buried as well. And it becomes a space for us to think on these, the meaning of life and what to preserve, whether we can, as Keats has said, live a moment over again in our imagination. Maybe the promise of digital humanities is simply creating something that's a little bit more permanent. And I have to leave you with just one last thing. This is the site map that I'm working on with UTEP, and it will have Google Pens that will connect literary works with Roman sites. Thank you.
My main question here, how should philosophy be taught on site? I think it's pretty obvious, or I hope it would be, that it's great to teach the humanities on site, and especially that seems true of disciplines like history or art. Obviously, it's great if you want to study the Sistine Chapel to be in the Sistine Chapel or just to have visited it. It's great to study the Forum or the Temple of Vesta, being in the Forum in front of the Temple of Vesta. But what about philosophy? Does philosophy gain anything from studying it on site? Well, I've been teaching philosophy on site now for several years, and I can tell you one model that I initially had was kind of lame. I would basically point at something and then present philosophy as usual. So for instance, I might say, hey, that's Marcus Aurelius, and now let me give my normal lecture on Stoicism and Marcus Aurelius. And it's actually not the worst way of doing things. They learn something, and of course, it's like being in a classroom with really great stuff all around you. But I was figuring surely there must be a better model of doing that. And strangely enough, my clue for how to rethink teaching philosophy on site came to me in the Colosseum. It's pretty hard to be there and not wonder why Romans killed people and animals for sport. The place is a lot like a modern sports arena, so we start thinking about violent spectacle in our society. So being in the place gives you a kind of sense of the spot, but also some critical distance, which leads almost everyone there, I think, to start asking questions. And in fact, here's my curious hypothesis. I wonder if the most philosophical questioning on any given day in the world happens in the Colosseum. People who would never wade into a book by Immanuel Kant find themselves knee-deep in fundamental subjects of philosophy. Aesthetics, what's so enjoyable about bloodshed? Ethics, when is it right to be a spectator of violence, if ever? Politics, what role should bread and circuses play in society? Human nature, what does the persistence of violent spectacle tell us about who we are? Or as my wife asks when she's in the Colosseum, what's wrong with people? And then it turns out philosophers have been asking those same questions about the Colosseum itself. Seneca has a couple great letters. He predates the Colosseum a bit, but he has a couple great letters about the gladiatorial games that are interestingly reflecting on those very questions and tie really interestingly into Seneca's own philosophy. Many of you may be familiar with Augustine's Confessions, Book 6, where he talks about his friend who couldn't tear himself away from the games. And so I started to come up with a better model of teaching philosophy on site, especially in Rome. And that's to use the questions generated by places to do philosophy, and then also to study the philosophy and connect it to those places. So a couple examples, think of the Protestant cemetery. I think in most cemeteries, people start naturally asking philosophical questions about what the good life is. The Protestant cemetery does that in spades because almost everyone who's buried there died on an adventure far from home. So it's hard not to ask, what's the good life all about? That can connect any number of different philosophies. The Forum, almost inevitable, we start thinking about the nature of politics. Cicero himself reflects on politics in relationship to the Forum itself. And then if you think of paintings and sculptures, rather than just see them as depicting a philosopher or a set of philosophers, to think of how does, say, a painting like the School of Athens philosophize itself? How does it connect up to a conception of how we do philosophy? How might it connect to Renaissance philosophy? Or how might a statue, say, of Marcus Aurelius, reflect Marcus's ideas in the Meditations? So if we go back to January, I had all these great ideas, and I had just gotten some professional development money. I'd rounded up a great group of students with my colleague, Dr. Schlueter, there, and we can't wait to take them to Rome, and I get to try out all my new ideas, and then I'm going to go to the new directions in the Humanities conference in Venice. 2020 is going to be the best year ever. The bad news is that I've had occasion this summer to find relevance in how Marcus Aurelius used Stoicism to deal with the pandemic that happens to be named after him, the Antonine Plague, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. But the good news is that philosophy can still happen on site. Where I live also has graveyards, a stadium, public spaces, and for that matter, quarantine perhaps can teach us something. So I can use that in my own pedagogy. But moreover, I can bring maybe some of the places and artifacts of Rome to the classroom through the kind of digital means like my colleagues have been talking about to spice up the philosophy I'm teaching and maybe do a bit of both. Here are three big lessons I've learned from teaching in our program. The first one is that the humanities are mutually reinforcing. Again, kind of an obvious point, but I think one that needs to be emphasized. Certainly the study of philosophy benefits from history, art, and literature, and vice versa. Number two, again, pretty obvious, being on site enhances the humanities and the study of the humanities, but maybe a little less well recognized is that very much can include philosophy. I think that we've all had occasion to reflect on how much place affects our thinking in this quarantine. And so maybe philosophy can learn from that and carry that beyond. And then technology. I mean, technology can be so distracting and distancing for our students when they're on site. But one of the things I've been learning, especially from my colleagues, is how useful it can be when it's being used to enhance those first two lessons about the nature of the humanities and the power of being on site. So thank you for listening to our panel, and I'm hoping that the day comes soon when we run into each other on the streets of Rome or the canals of Venice.